Hi guys! It is so nice to see you again. I loved watching everybody's Flipgrids from last week. It was really good to actually see you guys, and a lot of you had super cute pets, so that definitely made looking through those much better. So last week we talked about abiotic and biotic factors. We also talked about different levels of organization. This week, we're going to kind of be focusing on that ecosystem level, okay? So we're going to be talking about producers and consumers, food webs and food chains, and how energy moves through an ecosystem, okay? So let's get started. Okay, guys, so we're going to start off talking about producers versus consumers. So hopefully you guys have already talked about this, and this will be a little bit of a review. If not, then we're just going to get right into it, okay? So first up is a primary producer. Now, this is something that harvests energy from the sun by photosynthesis. So you might also know it by the name autotroph. Okay, which means it uses energy from the sun. It doesn't have to eat any other animals or plants, right? So that is a primary producer. A consumer, on the other hand, needs energy from plants and animals. So it eats things to get its energy, and that's also called a heterotroph. Okay? So that's the difference between producer and consumer. We're going to get a little bit deeper into different types of consumers because there's a lot of different types. So we're going to talk about 6 today. Okay, so the first one is an herbivore. Now this is a heterotroph that eats plants. Okay, so things like cows, rabbits, deer, caterpillars are all examples of herbivores. Okay? Carnivores eat animals, so they catch and kill their prey. So a carnivore will kill its own prey. So things like snakes, dogs, owls, these are all carnivores. Okay? An omnivore is a heterotroph that will eat both plants and animals. So humans are one example, and also bears are another example. Okay? Okay, Minnie. The fourth one is probably a little bit new to you guys. It's called a detritivore. This is something that eats detritus. Now, what is detritus? That is just decomposing organic matter. So if you see a forest with a bunch of dead leaves on the ground, or an animal has died and is starting to decompose, detritivores will help break that down. Okay? So those are things like earthworms and snails. Okay? Our fifth one is a decomposer. This breaks down that organic matter. So decomposers produce the detritus for the detritivores. Okay? So things like bacteria and fungi, so mushrooms, things like that. Okay? And our last type of consumer that we're going to talk about is a scavenger. So this consumes carcasses of dead animals. These don't typically kill their own prey. So things like vultures and hyenas. So if you're asked a question and you're not sure whether it's a scavenger or a carnivore, if it has caught and killed its own prey, it's a carnivore. If it has not killed its prey, it is a scavenger. Okay? Cool. All right, so now we're going to take what we know about producers and consumers, and we're going to put them into situations where we can see how they work together. So these are things like food chains and food webs. So a food chain is a series of steps in which organisms transfer energy by eating and being eaten. So whether we're looking at a food chain or a food web, the arrows that are connecting organisms are pointing the direction that the energy is going. And when we're looking at these, you also have to remember that from one organism to the next, only 10% of that energy is transferred. So something that is eating another organism, another animal or plant, has to eat more because it's not getting all of that energy from that organism. Whereas that primary producer is getting a lot of energy because it's coming straight from the sun. Okay? So, an example of a food chain. We're just going to start off with the words that we've kind of been talking about. So we're going to start off with a primary producer, something like grass, for example, okay? And that's going to go to an herbivore. So rabbit is the example we're going to use here. That herbivore is eaten by a consumer, so a fox in this case, which is eaten by another consumer, and in this case will be a coyote, and that is eaten by another consumer, which is a bear. So this is an example of a food chain. It just shows how certain organisms transfer energy by eating or being eaten. Okay? So now we're going to get a little bit more complicated. We're going to talk about something called trophic levels. So these are levels that we look at when we're talking about a food chain or a food web to describe where this organism falls. So we've already talked about primary producers, and those are things that produce their own food. Okay? The second trophic level is called a first level consumer. So a first level consumer is the thing that eats the primary producer. It's that first thing. Okay? The third trophic level is the second level consumer. So it can get a little bit confusing, but it is the third level. It's the third thing in the food chain or food web, but it is the second thing that is consuming something else. And then the last level is a third level consumer. So it is the third organism that is eating something else. Okay, so if we look back at our food chain we were talking about earlier, the grass is the primary producer, right? The first level consumer would be the rabbit because it is the first thing eating something else. The second level consumer would be the fox. The third level consumer would be the coyote. And trophic levels just keep going. So our fourth level consumer would be the bear. So you just keep adding on numbers to fit however many levels you have in your food chain or your food web. Okay? So we're going to talk about disturbances now. So a disturbance can come along that affects, let's say in this case, all of the rabbits in this ecosystem die. What's going to happen to that food chain? Well, the grass isn't going to have anything eating it, so it's going to grow and grow and grow and grow. The foxes aren't going to have anything to eat, so they're probably going to start dying out. The coyotes then don't have anything to eat, and same with the bears. So if you have a disturbance on one level of this food chain or a food web, it can affect the entire ecosystem. Alright guys, so the last thing that we're going to talk about are food webs. So these are networks of complex interactions that are formed by feeding relationships among various organisms in an ecosystem. Okay? So these are going to be more complicated than food chains because you're looking at multiple different organisms in the same ecosystem. Okay guys, so we're going to go through this food chain that we have here. So we're going to start off with a primary producer. And in this case, we're going to say something like grass, right? It makes its own food, it comes from the sun, and that's going to go to an herbivore. And in this case, we're going to say that is a rabbit. Okay. Next, we're going to go to a consumer, and we're going to say this is a fox, to another consumer, and in this case a coyote, to another consumer. Okay. And we're going to say that is a bear. So with our food chain, notice that these arrows are pointing where that energy is going. So when this rabbit eats the grass, it's gaining the energy from that grass. When the fox eats the rabbit, it's gaining the energy from that rabbit. So we're not pointing to what is eating what, we're pointing where the energy is going. Okay guys, so now that we talked about our trophic levels, we're going to go back and put them onto our food chain, okay? So we already know that this is our primary producer, right? So this is the thing that gets its energy from the sun. It produces its own food, okay? So our second level here is our first level consumer, okay? So this is the first thing that eats something else. It's the first level, okay? Our next one is our second level consumer, because it is the second thing that eats something else, right? The next one is our third level consumer. And with trophic levels, you just keep going up. So this last one here would be the fourth level consumer. Okay. All right, guys, so now we're going to talk about disturbances. So let's say in this case, something happens and there's no more rabbits, okay? So this grass, it's just going to keep growing and growing and growing because there's nothing there to eat it, right? Now, the fox no longer has food, so these are going to start dying out. Then the coyote has no food, so now we have less coyotes, and same with the bear. So a disturbance on one level of a food chain or a food web can affect the entire ecosystem. Alright guys, so I have a food web drawn out for you. Now, this is a little bit more complicated than a food chain, right? So down here we have carrots, grasses, grains, and these are going to different things. So let's first try to see what trophic levels these things fall into, right? So the easiest one to start off with is our primary producers. These are the things that are on the very bottom and they produce their own food. So we have carrots, grasses, and grains. All of these are primary producers. Okay. So then we're going to go to our second level, right? Our first level consumers, the first things that eat something else. So if we follow these arrows, one is rabbits, right? First level. Another one is grasshoppers, first level. Mice, right? First level. And birds, first level, right? So birds, mice, grasshoppers, rabbits are our first level consumers. These are the first things that are eating something else, okay? So now I want you guys to try and find the second level consumers. Okay, so this one's a little bit more tricky, right? So we can start off, we know these foxes are second level consumers because they are the second thing to eat something else here, right? So second level. Okay. We can follow this up. Owls are another one. Okay. Now here's where it gets a little bit tricky, because if we look here, birds in this chain here are a second level consumer. But in this chain here, they are a first level consumer. So when you're looking at a food web, things can have more than one trophic level. So this would also be a second level consumer. Okay? So when we're looking through these, make sure you guys are looking to see, can this have more than one trophic level? Okay, so while we are talking about things that can have more than one trophic level, if we look at this chain here, we follow grasses, to grasshoppers, to birds. This is our second level consumer. Then we go up to foxes. So what would foxes be in this case? It would be a third level consumer. Good. Okay. So food webs can be a bit more confusing, so you just need to make sure that you have a way to organize them and you can figure out what level things are and how the energy is flowing through this ecosystem. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about with this food web is disturbances. Now in our food chain, we looked at what happens when the rabbits are all gone. So in this case, let's look at what happens if all of the foxes were to leave. Okay? So things like rabbits and birds would have no predators. So they would continue to increase and increase and increase. They would eat more of these carrots, these grasses. The birds would eat more grasshoppers, more grains. So you would have less of all these things because rabbits and birds are going crazy. They have nothing that's hunting them and keeping their numbers in check. And if things like the grasshoppers are going down because they have so many things eating them, these owls are also going to decrease. So in a food web, a disturbance can have a much bigger impact on the whole ecosystem. You can look at what's going to happen to the ecosystem as a whole rather than just one chain, right? So I'm going to leave you guys with one question to think about, and that is, think about different disturbances that could happen in this food web and what would happen to the ecosystem if that happened. So for example, if all of these grasshoppers here, what happened if something happened and all the grasshoppers were gone? How would that affect this ecosystem? So I'm going to leave you guys with that. If you have any questions, I would love to see you during office hours or just email me, and I will see you guys again next week.